Existential vacuum. You wake up, go through the motions, check off the list. Work gets done, bills get paid, conversations happen. But underneath it all, there's a question you can't silence. What's the point? Not in some dramatic life crisis way. You're not about to quit everything and disappear. It's quieter than that. A persistent emptiness that doesn't leave, no matter how busy you get. You're functioning, maybe even succeeding, but it all feels hollow. Like you're playing a part in a script you never agreed to. This isn't depression. It's something more specific. Psychologist Viktor Frankl called it the existential vacuum. Life continues, but meaning has drained out of it. You're not sad. You're not hopeless. You're just empty. The vacuum doesn't announce itself. It creeps in slowly. At first, you think it's just boredom. Burnout, maybe. You tell yourself you need a break, a vacation, a new project. So you try. You fill your calendar, pick up hobbies, scroll through anything that might help. But the emptiness doesn't move, because this isn't about what you're doing. It's about why you're doing it. And that answer has gone missing. Here's what makes it disorienting. On the surface, everything looks fine. Your life might even look successful. Good jobs, stable relationships, plans ahead. But inside, there's a disconnect. The achievements don't register. The connections feel distant. The future looks like more of the same blankness stretching out. Frankl saw this pattern everywhere. In concentration camp survivors, yes. But also in wealthy, successful people living comfortable lives. The vacuum doesn't care about circumstances. It shows up when the structures that used to give life direction start to feel arbitrary. You go to work because that's what people do. You maintain relationships because it's expected. You pursue goals because you're supposed to want something. But the internal sense of this matters has evaporated. And here's what makes it worse. The vacuum feeds on itself. The emptier you feel, the harder it becomes to connect with anything that might fill it. You try new experiences, but they wash over you. You reach for meaning in achievements, relationships, causes. Nothing lands. It's like trying to grab smoke. The more you search for significance, the more it slips away. There's a strange contradiction here. You're surrounded by options, possibilities, freedoms previous generations never had. But that abundance doesn't translate into fulfillment. If anything, it makes the vacuum more obvious. When you can do almost anything, and none of it feels meaningful, the problem isn't your circumstances. It's something deeper. The vacuum doesn't resolve through distraction or achievement. It persists until you confront the question it's asking. Not what should I do, but what do I actually care about? Not what role should I play, but what life do I want to build? And that's a question most people avoid, because the answer isn't obvious, and the search for it can be uncomfortable. What you're left with is functional emptiness, going through the right motions while feeling fundamentally disconnected from them. And the longer it lasts, the more normal it starts to feel. Like this is just what life is now. Not terrible, not tragic, just blank. Meaning crisis. One day, the things that used to make sense don't anymore. Not because anything catastrophic happened. You just look around and realize the frameworks you've been living by, the beliefs that structured your world, don't hold up. And now you're standing in the rubble, trying to figure out what to build next. This is the meaning crisis. It's different from losing a goal or a purpose. It's deeper. It's when the entire system you use to interpret life stops working. The system that told you what matters, who you are, how to decide what's worth doing. Without that system, everything becomes uncertain. It often starts with doubt, a small crack in something you used to believe. Maybe it's a value you were raised with that doesn't fit your experience anymore. Maybe it's a goal you chased for years that feels hollow once you reach it. Maybe it's a relationship or community that defined you, and now it's gone. At first, you tell yourself it's temporary. You'll rebuild. You'll find a new direction. But the crack widens. More questions flood in. What actually matters? What should I be working toward? Who am I when I'm not performing the role I've always played? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're visceral, destabilizing. And they don't come with easy answers, because the tools you use to answer them, the belief systems, the narratives, the certainties, those are exactly what's broken. The crisis doesn't just affect individuals. It's cultural, generational. People used to inherit meaning. From religion, from tradition, from community structures that told them who they were and what their life should look like. But those structures have weakened. For many, they've collapsed entirely, and what's replaced them? A marketplace of options. Influencers, ideologies, self-help frameworks. None of them binding, none of them permanent. All of them competing for attention. So you're left assembling your own meaning from pieces that don't fit together. You borrow from this philosophy, a practice from that tradition, a goal from someone else's life. But it feels fragile, improvised. Like you're making it up as you go. Because you are. And deep down, you know that if you're just constructing meaning rather than discovering it, maybe it's not really meaningful at all. The crisis intensifies when you realize how many people around you are going through the same thing but pretending they're not. Everyone projects certainty. They have their routines, their ambitions, their identities. But scratch the surface and you find the same questions, the same doubts, the same quiet panic that maybe none of this adds up to anything. What makes it unbearable is that you can't go back. Once you've seen the arbitrariness, once you've questioned the foundations, you can't unsee it. You can try to rebuild, but the new structure will always carry the knowledge that it's constructed, not given. And that knowledge changes everything. It makes meaning feel optional. Fragile, like something you have to constantly defend rather than something that simply is. People in the middle of a meaning crisis often describe it as a kind of existential vertigo. The ground has disappeared, and they're free falling through questions with no answers. Some try to numb it, diving into work, relationships, substances, anything to avoid the void. Others double down on rigid belief systems, not because they truly believe, but because the certainty feels better than the chaos. But neither approach resolves it. The crisis doesn't end when you find a new answer. It ends when you learn to live with the questions, when you stop expecting meaning to be handed to you and start building it yourself, knowing full well that it's fragile, incomplete, and subject to change. And even then, the doubt never fully goes away. It just becomes something you carry, a constant reminder that meaning isn't a destination. It's a practice. And some days that practice feels impossible. Anomie. The rules stop making sense. Not all at once. But slowly you realize the systems you've been following, the structures that told you how to behave, what to value, how to succeed. They're arbitrary. Made up. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. This is anomie. A state where social norms lose their grip. Where the guidelines that used to organize life dissolve, leaving you in a space with no clear directions. No shared understanding of what's right, what's expected, what matters. You're free, technically. But that freedom feels more like falling. It happens when the structures collapse. A job loss that reveals work was just performative ritual. A relationship ending that shows you how much of yourself was just playing a role. A belief system cracking that exposes how much you were following scripts written by others. The moment you realize the rules weren't natural laws. They were just agreements. And the agreement has ended. What makes anomie destabilizing is that you're not just losing structure. You're losing the ability to know what's normal. When everyone around you still follows the rules, you feel like you're the one who's broken. When the rules themselves are collapsing culturally, you feel like you're floating in chaos with everyone else, and no one knows how to navigate. People experiencing anomie describe a specific disorientation. It's not rebellion. Rebellion still recognizes the rules, it just refuses them. Anomie is deeper. It's when the rules themselves stop registering as real. You see people following them and you can't understand why. The logic has evaporated. The justification has disappeared. And you're left wondering how everyone else is still pretending. Anomie accelerates in transitions. Societal shifts, cultural upheavals, economic collapses. When the old order breaks down and the new order hasn't formed yet. In that gap, people drift. Some double down on the old rules even harder, clinging to structure that's already gone. Others swing wildly, trying every new framework, finding none that stick. Most just float, waiting for something solid to emerge. The trap is that anomie makes everything feel optional. Morality becomes preference. Meaning becomes choice. Truth becomes perspective. And without anchors, without shared agreements about what's real and what matters, you're left constructing your own framework in isolation. Which works until you realize that a framework only you follow isn't really a framework at all. Anomie doesn't resolve when you find new rules. It resolves when you understand that all rules are constructed, and the question isn't which ones are true, but which ones you're willing to commit to anyway. Not because they're natural, because they're necessary, because without some shared structure, individual freedom becomes collective chaos. And chaos, it turns out, is worse than arbitrary rules. Depersonalization. You're watching yourself from somewhere else. Talking, moving, responding. But it doesn't feel like you. It feels like you're operating a body remotely. Going through motions that should be automatic but now require conscious effort. Like you're an actor playing yourself, and you've forgotten you're supposed to be the character, not just the performance. This is depersonalization. A disconnect between your sense of self and your lived experience. You're present, but you're not inhabiting presence. You're observing your life from a distance you can't close. Everything feels unreal, dreamlike, muted, like you're watching a movie of your existence rather than actually living it. It often starts during stress, a moment of overwhelm where your mind protects itself by creating distance. You're in a conversation, but you're also watching yourself have the conversation. You're making decisions, but they feel like someone else's choices. Your emotions are there, but they're happening to a person you're observing, not experiencing directly. What makes depersonalization so unsettling is that you're aware of it happening. You know you should feel more connected to your own life. You know this detachment isn't normal. But knowing doesn't fix it. The awareness just makes the gap more obvious. You're conscious of being disconnected from your own consciousness. People describe it as feeling like a ghost in their own body, or like they're living behind glass. Everything is visible, technically accessible, but there's a barrier they can't break through. Touch doesn't register fully. Emotions feel theoretical. Memories seem like they belong to someone else. Even your own reflection looks slightly wrong. Familiar but foreign. Depersonalization can become chronic. What starts as a protective response to stress becomes a permanent mode. You get used to the distance. You learn to function while disconnected. But functioning isn't the same as living. You're present for your life without actually being in it. Going through experiences that should matter but that slide off without sticking. The cruelest part is that depersonalization is invisible. You look fine. You're handling your responsibilities. You're showing up. So, when you try to explain that you feel like you're not really there, people don't understand. How can you be talking about feeling absent while clearly being present? But presence isn't the same as inhabiting. And depersonalization is the gap between existing and feeling like you exist. Recovery isn't about forcing connection. It's about finding small moments where the distance closes, where something breaks through the glass. A sensation that registers fully. An emotion that lands directly. A moment where you're not watching yourself live, you're just living. And slowly those moments expand until the observer and the observed collapse back into one. Hopelessness. The future used to be something. A direction, a possibility, a reason to keep going. But now when you try to imagine what comes next, there's nothing. Not darkness, not disaster, just blank space. Like the timeline stops at today and refuses to extend further. This is hopelessness, not sadness about what might happen. The absence of belief that anything will happen. That anything can change. That effort makes a difference. The future hasn't disappeared because it's been taken away. It's disappeared because you can't generate the imagination required to see it. Hopelessness doesn't announce itself as giving up. It arrives as realism. You stop making plans because plans feel pointless. You stop trying because trying hasn't worked. You stop hoping because hope has only led to disappointment. And you tell yourself this is just being practical. Adjusting expectations. Accepting reality. But what you're actually doing is collapsing the future into the present and deciding nothing will ever be different. What makes hopelessness so complete is that it removes the mechanism of change. When you believe the future can be different, you act. You adjust, you try new approaches, you persist through setbacks. But when you believe the future is fixed, when you're convinced that no action will alter the outcome, effort becomes irrational. Why try when trying changes nothing? People experiencing hopelessness describe a specific kind of paralysis. They're not lazy. They're not avoiding responsibility. They've just run the calculations and concluded that input doesn't affect output. That their choices don't matter. That the system is rigged. The outcome is determined, the game is unwinnable. And once you believe that, participation feels absurd. Hopelessness compounds because it becomes self-fulfilling. When you stop trying, things stop improving. When things don't improve, it confirms your belief that trying doesn't work. The cycle tightens. Evidence accumulates. And the gap between where you are and where you want to be becomes so vast that bridging it seems impossible. The trap is that hopelessness feels like clarity. Like you've finally seen through the illusion. Everyone else is chasing futures that won't arrive, clinging to hope that's fundamentally irrational. But you know better. You've accepted the truth. Accept that truth, the one that says nothing will ever change. It's not actually more accurate than hope. It's just more final. Hopelessness doesn't break when the future suddenly improves. It breaks when you realize that the future doesn't exist yet, which means it's not determined. That uncertainty, the thing that felt like a threat, is actually the only thing that makes change possible. The future is unwritten. That's not hopelessness. That's potential. But seeing potential requires believing your actions might matter. And that's the belief hopelessness has erased. Disconnection. You reach out and nothing reeks back. You send the message, make the call, show up at the gathering. You're trying. Actively trying. But the connection doesn't form, or it forms briefly and then dissolves. And you're left wondering if the problem is them, or the situation, or if you've somehow become fundamentally unreachable. This is disconnection. Not isolation you chose. Separation that happens despite your efforts. You're surrounded by opportunities for connection, but they don't convert into actual relationships. Conversations stay surface level. Interactions remain transactional. Closeness never deepens. You're in proximity to people without actually being with them. Disconnection happens in layers. First, the easy connections fall away. The friends you saw regularly but never talked about anything real. Then the deeper ones start to thin. Life diverges, priorities shift, and maintaining the relationship requires effort that one or both of you stops making. Eventually, you're surrounded by acquaintances and distant connections, but the people who actually know you have disappeared. What makes disconnection so disorienting is that you can't always identify why it's happening. Sometimes people drift naturally. Sometimes you've changed in ways that make old connections incompatible. Sometimes you're the one pulling away without realizing it, creating distance while simultaneously feeling abandoned. The causality gets murky, and you're left with the result without understanding the process. People experiencing disconnection often describe a pattern. They initiate, they invite, they make the effort. But the responses are tepid. Plans get cancelled. Conversations trail off. And slowly, they stop reaching out because the rejection, even the soft kind, becomes too exhausting. They tell themselves they're just being realistic. If people wanted to connect, they would. But what they don't realize is that everyone else is running the same calculation, waiting for proof of interest before investing their own. Disconnection accelerates in modern life. You can be digitally connected to hundreds of people and still feel completely alone. You can have active group chats and zero meaningful conversations. You can attend events, join communities, participate in shared spaces, and still leave feeling like you were never actually there. Proximity isn't connection. Interaction isn't intimacy. And the more you substitute one for the other, the more disconnected you become. The cruel irony is that disconnection makes connection harder. When you feel cut off, you become cautious. You don't want to impose. You don't want to be needy. So you hold back, wait for clear invitations, avoid vulnerability. But connection requires risk. It requires someone going first. And when everyone is protecting themselves from further disconnection, no one reaches far enough to actually bridge the gap. Disconnection doesn't resolve by finding better people. It resolves when you stop waiting for connection to feel safe and start accepting that it never will. That reaching out might not work. That vulnerability might not be returned. But the alternative, protecting yourself into complete isolation, guarantees the outcome you're trying to avoid. Connection requires showing up even when you're not sure anyone will meet you there. And sometimes they won't. Meaninglessness. Why does any of this matter? Not in a philosophical thought experiment way. In a real, immediate level way. You're doing the things, following the path, checking the boxes. But when you step back and ask what it's all for, the answer doesn't come. Or it comes and it's not satisfying. Or it used to come and now it doesn't. And you're left performing actions that feel increasingly hollow. This is meaninglessness. Not the absence of goals or the lack of activity. The absence of significance. You can be busy, productive, even successful, and still feel like you're moving through a series of tasks that don't add up to anything that matters. The structure is there. The meaning isn't. Meaninglessness often hides behind functionality. You wake up, you work, you interact, you maintain your life. From the outside, everything looks fine. But internally there's a constant low-level question. Why am I doing this? And when you can't answer it, when the justifications feel thin or borrowed or imposed, the actions start to feel mechanical. You're going through motions without the motivation that used to drive them. What makes meaninglessness different from emptiness, or the existential vacuum, is its focus. It's not about the absence of feeling. It's about the absence of justification. You can feel things. You can want things. But you can't explain why those things should matter. Why this goal over that one? Why this path instead of any other? The choosing feels arbitrary. And when choice feels arbitrary, commitment becomes impossible. People experiencing meaninglessness describe a specific exhaustion. Not physical tiredness. Existential fatigue. The weight of continuing to do things you can't defend. You keep working, but you can't remember why the work matters. You maintain relationships, but you can't articulate why these people over others. You pursue goals, but when you imagine achieving them, the achievement doesn't seem to change anything. Meaninglessness intensifies when you realize that most people aren't asking these questions. They're just doing, working, relating, striving, without pausing to interrogate the foundation. And part of you wonders if that's the answer. If meaning isn't something you find, it's something you stop looking for. If the secret is just accepting the doing without demanding justification. But you can't unknow the question once it's been asked. You can't return to unreflective action after you've seen how arbitrary it all is. And so you're stuck in a loop. Doing things you can't justify. Stopping feels impossible because life requires action. But continuing without meaning feels equally impossible because action without purpose is just exhausting. Meaninglessness doesn't resolve when you find the right answer. Because there isn't a right answer. It resolves when you accept that meaning isn't discovered, it's constructed. That you won't find it written into the universe. You have to decide what matters and commit to that decision, knowing full well that the commitment is a choice, not a truth. And that's uncomfortable. Because it means nothing matters inherently. It only matters because you decide it does. But that decision, arbitrary as it is the only thing that makes continued action possible. Identity diffusion. Who are you? Not your name or your job title. Who are you actually? When you try to answer, the response fragments. You're different things to different people. Different versions of yourself in different contexts. And when you try to find the core, the consistent self underneath all the variations, it's not there. Or it's there but it's so diluted, so spread across contradictory versions, that it doesn't hold together anymore. This is identity diffusion. Not the exploration of different identities. The inability to form a coherent one. You contain multitudes, but they don't integrate. They compete. Each context pulls you in a different direction. Each role demands a different performance. And you cycle through them without ever landing on something that feels genuinely, consistently you. Identity diffusion often starts in adolescence, but it doesn't always resolve. Some people move through the exploration and arrive at a stable sense of self. Others keep fragmenting. They try on identities, commit temporarily, then abandon them when they stop fitting. They shift careers, relationships, locations, always looking for the configuration that will finally click. But the clicking never happens because the problem isn't the external circumstances. It's the lack of internal coherence. What makes diffusion so destabilizing is that it affects decision-making. When you don't have a clear sense of who you are, you can't make choices that align with your values. Because your values keep shifting. What matters today contradicts what mattered yesterday. What you want in this context conflicts with what you want in that one. And you're left making decisions based on immediate pressure rather than long-term direction. People experiencing identity diffusion describe a specific kind of instability. They're highly adaptable. They can fit into almost any environment. But that adaptability comes at a cost. They become whoever the situation needs them to be. And when the situation changes, they change with it. There's no anchor. No core self that remains constant across contexts. Diffusion intensifies in environments that demand flexibility. Modern work expects you to be collaborative and independent. Assertive and agreeable. Ambitious and balanced. Relationships demand openness and boundaries. Vulnerability and self-sufficiency. And instead of holding these tensions within a coherent identity, you split. One version for work, another for relationships, another for family, another for friends. And none of them feel fully real. The trap is that identity diffusion can look like freedom. You're not boxed in by a fixed sense of self. You can be anything, go anywhere, try everything. But that freedom becomes paralyzing when you realize you can't build anything stable without some consistency. Relationships require you to be recognizable. Careers require sustained direction. Growth requires knowing what you're growing from. And diffusion makes all of that impossible. Identity diffusion doesn't resolve by finding your true self. Because the idea of a single, true self is the problem. It resolves when you accept that identity is always multiple, always contextual. But that doesn't mean it has to be incoherent. You can hold different versions without fracturing. You can adapt without disappearing. But that requires making choices about which variations to cultivate and which to let go. It requires commitment, even provisional commitment, to some version of yourself. And that's what diffusion has been avoiding all along. Purpose deficit. You have goals. Plenty of them. Get the promotion. Finish the project. Hit the milestone. You're moving towards something, checking things off, making progress. But when you ask yourself why any of it matters, the answer doesn't come. Or it comes and it's shallow. You're working toward achievements that don't connect to anything deeper. Goals without purpose. Motion without direction. This is purpose deficit. You're not aimless. You're actively pursuing things. But the pursuing feels empty because there's no larger framework holding it together. No answer to the question, what's this all for? You're climbing a ladder that's leaning against nothing. The deficit shows up as a gap between activity and significance. You can be incredibly busy and still feel it. Working hard, achieving results, advancing in measurable ways. But none of it feels like it's building towards something meaningful. The goals are arbitrary, selected because they seemed important, or because other people valued them, or because you needed something to aim for. Not because they connect to a deeper sense of what you're trying to create with your life. What makes purpose deficit so persistent is that it's invisible from the outside. Success looks like success. Achievement looks like achievement. People congratulate you on your progress. But inside, there's a growing awareness that you're optimizing for outcomes you don't actually care about. You're winning a game you never chose to play. People experiencing purpose deficit often describe a specific kind of exhaustion. They're not burnt out from overwork. They're depleted from pursuing goals that don't matter to them. Every achievement lands flat. Every milestone passes without satisfaction. Because the problem isn't that they're failing. It's that they're succeeding at the wrong things. The trap is that purpose deficit can hide behind productivity. As long as you have goals, as long as you're making progress, it looks like you have direction. But goals aren't the same as purpose. Goals are specific, achievable, measurable. Purpose is the reason behind them. And when the reason is missing, when you're just collecting achievements without knowing why, the motion starts to feel meaningless. Purpose deficit also compounds over time. The more you invest in goals without purpose, the harder it becomes to change direction. You've built a life around these objectives. Walked away would mean admitting all that effort was misdirected. So you keep going. You keep achieving. And the gap between what you're doing and what you actually care about widens until it becomes unbridgeable. Recovery requires stopping. Not to rest. To ask what you're actually trying to build. Not what looks impressive. Not what other people value. What matters to you in a way that justifies the effort you're putting in. And that's uncomfortable because it might mean abandoning goals you've been chasing for years. But continuing without purpose guarantees that every achievement will feel hollow. And eventually, you'll run out of energy to keep pretending that motion equals meaning. Spiritual emptiness. Something's missing, but you can't name it. Not happiness. Not success. Not connection. Something underneath all of that. A sense of being part of something larger. A feeling that life has a dimension beyond the immediate, the practical, the visible. But when you reach for that sense, there's nothing there. Just a blank space where meaning used to live. This is spiritual emptiness. And it has nothing to do with religion. You don't need to believe in anything supernatural to feel it. It's the absence of transcendence. The feeling that life is only what you can see and touch and measure. That there's no deeper layer. No larger story. No connection to anything beyond yourself and your immediate concerns. Spiritual emptiness often goes unnoticed until something breaks. A loss, a crisis. A moment where the ordinary structures fail. and you need something more to hold on to. And that's when you realize the framework isn't there. You've built a life on practical foundations, efficiency, achievement, relationships, but none of it touches the part of you that needs to feel like existence means something beyond survival and comfort. What makes spiritual emptiness so disorienting is that it's not about belief. You can be intellectually certain that life has no inherent meaning and still feel spiritually full if you've found practices, communities, or experiences that create a sense of connection. But when those are absent, when life becomes entirely transactional, entirely self-contained, the emptiness becomes palpable. You're going through the motions without ever touching something that feels sacred. People describe it as a kind of flatness. Life is fine. You're managing. But there's no awe. No reverence. No moments where you feel part of something that exceeds your understanding. Everything is explained, controlled, optimized. And in that total demystification, something essential has been lost. Spiritual emptiness accelerates in environments that reduce everything to utility. When relationships become networking. When nature becomes scenery. When art becomes content. When every experience is evaluated for what it can do for you rather than what it is in itself. The more instrumental life becomes, the less room there is for the kind of meaning that doesn't serve a purpose. That just is. The cruelest part is that spiritual emptiness can't be fixed with more of what you already have. More success, more relationships, more experiences, they don't fill it. Because what's missing isn't something you can acquire. It's a way of relating to existence. A capacity for wonder, for feeling like you're part of a reality that's bigger and stranger and more meaningful than the narrow band of concerns that fill your daily life. Spiritual emptiness doesn't resolve by finding the right belief system. It resolves when you stop reducing everything to what it can do for you and start allowing things to simply matter. When you make space for experiences that don't optimize anything. For questions that don't have answers. For moments that feel significant even though you can't explain why. That's not religion. That's the recovery of a dimension of existence that gets lost when life becomes entirely functional. Narrative breakdown. Your life used to make sense as a story. Not a perfect one, but coherent. You could explain how you got here. Why you made the choices you made. Where you were headed. The events connected. The trajectory held. And then something shifted. The story stopped working. The thread snapped. And now when you try to explain your life, even to yourself, it doesn't add up anymore. This is narrative breakdown. Not forgetting what happened. Losing the ability to make what happened mean something. You have all the pieces, the events, the choices, the turning points, but they don't form a story anymore. They're just a collection of disconnected moments. And without the story, you lose the sense of who you are. Narrative breakdown often follows disruption. A relationship ending that invalidates the story you were telling about your future. A career shift that makes your past experience irrelevant. A belief changing that reframes everything you've done. Suddenly, the narrative you've been living inside of doesn't work. And you're left with a past that doesn't lead to your present and a present that doesn't point to any clear future. What makes breakdown so destabilizing is that identity is narrative. You are the story you tell about yourself. When that story collapses, when you can't explain who you are or how you got here in a way that makes sense, you lose your grip on your own continuity. You're not the same person anymore. But you're also not a new person. You're just scattered pieces that don't assemble into anything coherent. People experiencing narrative breakdown describe a specific confusion. They can recount facts. This happened, then that happened. But the meaning has evaporated. The logic that used to connect those events has disappeared. They can't explain why they made certain choices, what they were thinking, what they believed would happen. The story they were following has become invisible, and without it, their own actions seem incomprehensible. Breakdown also affects decision-making. When you don't have a narrative, you don't know what to do next. Because decisions require direction. And direction comes from the story you're telling about where you're going. If the story is broken, if there's no through line connecting past to future, every choice becomes arbitrary. You're improvising without a plot. The trap is that narrative breakdown makes you vulnerable to other people's stories. When you don't have your own, you borrow. You adopt someone else's framework. Follow their path. Live according to their script. And it works temporarily. But borrowed narratives don't fit. They explain someone else's life, not yours. And eventually the mismatch becomes obvious, and you're back where you started. Narrative breakdown doesn't resolve by finding the right story. It resolves when you accept that the story is always provisional, that it will break and need rebuilding, that who you are isn't fixed in a single narrative, but constantly being rewritten as new information comes in. The breakdown isn't a failure. It's a transition. The old story stopped working. The new one hasn't formed yet. And learning to live in that gap, without rushing to force coherence, is the only way through. Value collapse. You used to know what mattered. Right and wrong. Good and bad. Important and trivial. The lines were clear. But somewhere along the way, those distinctions started blurring. Not because you stopped caring, because the values themselves started contradicting each other. What you believed about justice conflicts with what you believe about compassion. What you value in relationships contradicts what you value in independence. And now when you try to make a decision, the framework you relied on doesn't give you answers. It gives you competing imperatives that cancel each other out. This is value collapse. Not the loss of values, the inability to reconcile them. You still care about the same things, but you've realized they can't all be true at the same time. And without a hierarchy to organize them, without a way to decide which value takes precedence when they clash, you're paralyzed. Value collapse often happens when you're exposed to different perspectives. You grow up with one set of values, then encounter people who live by completely different principles and thrive. Their framework works for them. Yours works for you. But the frameworks are incompatible. And once you see that you can't pretend your values are universal, they're just preferences, choices. And if they're choices, what makes them right? What makes collapse so destabilizing is that values are supposed to be stable. They're the foundation you build everything else on. When they start shifting, when they start contradicting, you lose the ability to make confident decisions. Every choice becomes a negotiation between conflicting principles. And you're never sure if you're making the right call because the definition of right keeps changing depending on which value you prioritize. People experiencing value collapse describe a specific kind of doubt. Not uncertainty about facts. Uncertainty about what should matter. They can analyze a situation from multiple angles. See the merit in different approaches. Understand competing perspectives. But that understanding doesn't lead to clarity. It leads to indecision. Because they can no longer take their own values for granted. Collapse intensifies when you realize how much of your value system was inherited. Absorbed from family, culture, religion, without conscious examination. And when you start examining it, when you start asking why you believe what you believe, the answers feel insufficient. Because you do. Because that's what you were taught. Because it feels right. None of those are actual justifications. They're just descriptions of how you acquired your values. Not reasons to keep them. The trap is that value collapse can lead to relativism. If all values are constructed, if none are objectively true, then maybe nothing really matters. Maybe every choice is equally valid. Maybe morality is just opinion. And that sounds liberating until you realize it removes the basis for caring about anything. If nothing is truly better than anything else, why choose? Why commit? Why defend any position at all? Value collapse doesn't resolve by finding absolute values. Those don't exist outside belief systems you have to adopt on faith. It resolves when you accept that values are constructed and commit to them anyway. Not because they're true in some cosmic sense. Because they're yours. Because you've chosen them, examined them, and decided they're worth upholding even though you can't prove them. That's not certainty. But it's enough to act on. And action, it turns out, is what values are actually for. Existential dread. It's not fear of something specific. Not death, not failure, not loss. It's deeper. A background hum of unease that never quite resolves. You're fine. Life is manageable. But underneath the fine, there's a constant awareness that none of this is stable. That the ground could give way at any moment. That the structures holding everything together are more fragile than they appear. And that awareness sits with you, quiet but persistent, coloring everything with a low-level anxiety that won't lift. This is existential dread. The feeling that accompanies the realization that existence is fundamentally uncertain. That you're always one accident, one decision, one random event away from your entire life changing. And there's nothing you can do to make it safe. No amount of planning, preparation, or control can eliminate the basic precariousness of being alive. Dread doesn't come from immediate danger. It comes from awareness. The awareness that you're mortal. That everyone you love is mortal. That everything you build will eventually end. That the world is indifferent to your well-being. That meaning isn't guaranteed. That you're responsible for a life you didn't ask for and a future you can't predict. And that awareness, once it surfaces, doesn't go back underground. What makes existential dread so exhausting is that it's not actionable. When you're afraid of something concrete, you can respond. Avoid the danger. Fix the problem. But dread doesn't point to a specific threat. It points to the nature of existence itself. And you can't fix that. You can only learn to live with it. People experiencing existential dread describe it as a weight. Not overwhelming, just constant. A sense that nothing is quite solid. That joy is temporary. That safety is an illusion. That even in good moments, the knowledge of their impermanence is there, making it impossible to fully relax. You're always braced for the collapse you know is coming, even if you don't know when or how. Dread intensifies during transitions, when structures break down, when certainties are challenged, when the future becomes unpredictable. But it can also surface in stability, in the middle of an ordinary day. You're fine, and then suddenly you're aware of how not fine everything could become. How precarious the balance is. How much you're depending on things that are outside your control. The trap is that dread makes you want to retreat. Build walls. Control everything you can. Minimize risk. But that doesn't eliminate the dread. It just narrows your life. Because the dread isn't about what's happening. It's about the possibility of what could happen. And that possibility exists whether you engage with life or hide from it. Existential dread doesn't resolve by making life safer. It resolves when you accept that uncertainty is the condition of existence, not a problem to be solved. That the ground is always unstable. That control is always partial. That everything meaningful is also temporary. And that living anyway, fully despite all of that, is the only response that makes sense. The dread doesn't disappear, but it stops being the thing that decides what you do. Inner void. There's a space inside you that shouldn't be there. Not physical, not something you can point to, but you feel it. A hollow area where something used to be, or where something should be. You function around it. Work, relate, participate. But the void is always there. A silent absence at your center that you've learned to navigate around but never quite filled. This is the inner void. Not emptiness in the sense of lacking goals or relationships. A structural absence. Like a room in a house that's always dark, always cold, You know it's there. You pass by it constantly. But you've learned not to enter because when you do, there's nothing. Just space. Just silence. Just the awareness that something fundamental is missing. The void often forms early, from experiences that required you to hollow yourself out. Trauma that you survived by going numb. Attachment that never formed, leaving you without the internal sense of being held. Needs that went unmet so consistently you stopped feeling them. The void is what's left when parts of yourself that should have developed didn't. Or parts that existed got carved away. What makes the void so persistent is that you can't fill it from the outside. You try. Relationships, achievement, substances, distractions. You pour things into the space hoping something will stick. But nothing does. Because the void isn't a lack of external things. It's an internal structure that's missing. The capacity to hold on to what you're given. To feel nourished by what should nourish you. To be filled by what should fill you. People living with the inner void describe a kind of numbness. Not complete. You can still feel things. But there's a baseline emptiness that never quite goes away. Even in good moments. Even when things are working. There's always that hollow space reminding you that something inside you is fundamentally broken. That you're operating with a deficit no one else can see. The void creates specific patterns. You sabotage good things because deep down you don't believe you can keep them. You withdraw from connection because the void makes intimacy feel impossible. You chase intensity because maybe if the feeling is strong enough, it will finally reach the empty space. But it never does. The void remains. Untouched. Untouchable. The cruelest part is that the void makes you feel fundamentally alone. Not in the sense of being isolated. In the sense that even when people are close, even when you're being held, the void creates a separation they can't cross. They can't fill it. They can't fix it. They can reach toward you, but they can't reach the place that's empty. And knowing that, feeling that unbridgeable distance, reinforces the void's message that you're unreachable. That something about you is missing. That you'll always be hollow. The inner void doesn't heal by being filled. It heals when you stop trying to fill it and start learning to exist with it. When you accept that the emptiness is part of your structure now. Not something to fix or hide or overcome. Just something that is. And that acceptance, paradoxically, is what allows connection to happen. Because you stop expecting others to complete you. You stop demanding that experiences fill the unfillable. And in that release, in that acceptance of your own incompleteness, space opens for something real, not perfect, not whole, but real. And sometimes real is enough. Belonging without meaning. You're part of the group. You show up, participate, know the people. You're included in plans, invited to events, recognized as a member. From the outside, it looks like connection, like community. But inside, there's a disconnect. You belong to something that doesn't actually mean anything to you. You're in, but you're not invested. Present, but not engaged. Connected in form, but not in substance. This is belonging without meaning. You've achieved membership, but membership doesn't translate into significance. The group exists. You're part of it. But when you ask yourself why it matters, why you're there, what you're getting from it beyond the fact of being included, the answer is thin. Or missing entirely. It happens when belonging becomes the goal instead of the byproduct. You join because you're supposed to. Because everyone else is part of something. Because isolation feels worse than empty connection. So you find a group, any group, and you make yourself fit. And it works in a way. You're not alone anymore. But you're also not fulfilled, because the belonging doesn't connect to anything you actually care about. What makes this so disorienting is that it looks successful. You have community. You have people. You're part of something larger than yourself. All the things that are supposed to make life meaningful. but the meaning isn't there. The gatherings feel obligatory. The shared activities feel performative. The identity that comes from membership feels hollow. You're going through the motions of connection without experiencing the substance. People in this state often describe a specific loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone. The loneliness of being surrounded by people you don't actually connect with. You're in the room. You're part of the conversation. But you're not really there. You're observing your own participation from a distance, wondering why it feels so empty. Belonging without meaning compounds over time. The longer you stay in a group that doesn't matter to you, the harder it becomes to leave. You've invested time, built relationships, shallow as they are. Developed a role. Walking away would mean admitting it was all empty. So you stay. You keep showing up. And the gap between your presence and your actual investment widens. The trap is that this kind of belonging prevents you from finding meaningful connection. You're already part of something, so you stop looking. You've satisfied the external requirement for community, but the internal need for significance remains unmet. And you're stuck in a position where you have enough connection to avoid the discomfort of isolation, but not enough meaning to actually feel fulfilled. Belonging without meaning doesn't resolve by trying harder to care. You can't force significance. It resolves when you're honest about what the group actually means to you. When you stop confusing presence with connection. When you accept that belonging to something empty is worse than belonging to nothing. Because at least in the absence, you're free to search for something real. In empty belonging, you're just pretending. And pretending, it turns out, is more exhausting than being alone. Achievement emptiness. You did it. The thing you've been working toward for months, maybe years. The goal you told yourself would change everything. And for a moment, it does. There's relief. Satisfaction. The accomplishment is real. But then the feeling fades. Faster than you expected. And what you're left with isn't fulfillment. It's a question, now what? This is achievement emptiness, not the absence of success. The absence of meaning after success. You reached the milestone. Checked the box. Proved you could do it. But the proof doesn't feel like it proved anything. The achievement sits there, completed, and you realize it didn't change you the way you thought it would. You're still the same person. With the same problems, just with one more accomplishment that doesn't seem to matter. Achievement emptiness shows up most clearly in the gap between anticipation and arrival. The journey felt important. The goal felt significant. You told yourself that once you got there, everything would be different. Better job, better life, better you. But when you arrive, the transformation doesn't happen. The external change doesn't create internal shift. And you're left wondering why the thing you wanted so badly feels so hollow now that you have it. What makes this so destabilizing is that it undermines the entire logic of striving. If achievements don't bring fulfillment, what's the point of achieving? If goals don't make you feel the way you thought they would, why keep setting them? The emptiness calls into question not just this specific accomplishment, but the whole framework of working toward things. People experiencing achievement emptiness often describe a cycle. They set a new goal immediately, bigger this time, more ambitious, telling themselves that the last achievement was just too small, that the next one will be different. But the pattern repeats. The new goal is reached. The emptiness returns, and they're left chasing a feeling of completion that achievement, by itself, can't provide. The emptiness also reveals something uncomfortable, that you are using achievement as a substitute for something else. Identity, maybe, or proof of worth, or distraction from deeper questions about what you actually want from life. As long as you were striving, you didn't have to confront those questions. But now that you've arrived, now that the goal is met, there's nothing left to hide behind. and the questions you were avoiding are still there, unanswered. The trap is that achievement emptiness makes you doubt your own desires. If the things you wanted don't satisfy you, maybe you don't know what you want. Maybe you've been chasing the wrong goals. Maybe nothing will ever feel like enough. That doubt can spiral. It can make every future ambition feel suspect. Every new goal feel hollow before you even start. Achievement emptiness doesn't resolve by achieving more. It resolves when you separate accomplishment from fulfillment. When you stop expecting external milestones to create internal meaning, achievement can be valuable for what it is. Proof of capability, evidence of growth. But it's not where meaning comes from. Meaning comes from the process, from what you're building, from who you're becoming, not from the moment you cross the finish line. And once you understand that, achievement can exist without carrying the impossible weight of making your life feel complete. Success disillusionment. You made it. By every measurable standard, you succeeded. The career, the income, the recognition. The things you were told to want, you have, and it should feel like winning. But it doesn't. It feels like you've been sold a story that doesn't match the reality. Like success, the version you were chasing, was supposed to deliver something it can't. This is success disillusionment. Not failure. Not falling short. The realization that success itself is overrated. That the version of achievement you internalized, the one that promised satisfaction, validation, arrival, doesn't work the way you were told it would. You did everything right. And it still doesn't feel right. Disillusionment often follows a specific trajectory. You spend years working toward the markers of success. Each one feels important. Each one feels like progress. And then you reach them, one by one. The promotion, the title, the income bracket, the respect. And each time the satisfaction is brief, the glow fades, and you're left realizing that success didn't change the fundamental experience of being you. What makes disillusionment so bitter is the sense of betrayal. You believed in the script. You followed the path. You made sacrifices to get here. And now that you've arrived, you realize the promise was false. Not because you failed, because the promise itself was empty. Success doesn't make you happier. It doesn't make you more secure. It doesn't solve the problems you thought it would. It just gives you a different set of problems, often more isolating, with less sympathy. People experiencing success disillusionment describe a specific kind of loneliness. They can't complain. They've achieved what most people want. So when they try to articulate the emptiness, they're met with incomprehension. You're successful, what more do you want? And the answer is complicated. Because what they want isn't more success. It's the feeling they thought success would bring. The feeling that never came. Disillusionment also creates guilt. You have what others are striving for. You've reached a position others would envy, and you're ungrateful enough to feel empty about it. That guilt compounds the disillusionment. Because not only does success not feel good, feeling bad about success makes you feel worse. You're trapped between the external appearance of achievement and the internal reality of dissatisfaction. The cruelest part is that disillusionment doesn't come with an obvious alternative. If success doesn't work, what does? You can't go backward. You can't undo what you've achieved. And moving forward feels pointless when you don't believe the next level will feel any different. You're stuck in a position you worked hard to reach, knowing it wasn't worth the cost, but unable to see a way out that doesn't involve abandoning everything you've built. Success disillusionment doesn't resolve by achieving more or by quitting everything. It resolves when you separate success from meaning. When you stop expecting external validation to create internal worth. Success is fine for what it is: security, options, resources. But it's not a substitute for purpose. It's not a replacement for connection. It's not the answer to existential questions. Once you stop asking success to solve problems it was never designed to solve, it stops being disillusioning. It's just a set of circumstances. Nothing more. Nothing less. Purpose envy. You see them and it's obvious. They know what they're doing. Why they're doing it. Where they're going. They have direction, clarity, drive. And when they talk about their work, their cause, their path, there's a conviction you don't have. A certainty you can't access. They're not just busy. They're aligned. And watching them, you feel something between admiration and resentment. Because they have something you want. Not their specific purpose. Just purpose itself. The sense that what they're doing matters. This is purpose envy. Not jealousy of someone's achievements or circumstances. Envy of their internal clarity. Of the fact that they've found an answer to the question you're still struggling with. They know why they get up in the morning. And you don't. And that gap, that difference, feels more significant than any external success. Purpose envy intensifies when you're surrounded by people who seem certain. Colleagues who are passionate about their work. Friends who are committed to causes. People who have organized their entire lives around a single driving question. And you're just going through motions, trying different things, hoping something will click. But nothing does. And the more you see others with purpose, the more lost you feel. What makes purpose envy so painful is that it reveals what you don't have. You can be successful without purpose. You can be busy without purpose. You can even be happy temporarily without purpose. But when you're around someone who has it, the absence becomes obvious. They're building towards something. You're just maintaining. They have a reason. You have routines. And the contrast is stark enough to hurt. People experiencing purpose envy often describe a specific frustration. They want what the other person has, but they can't just adopt it. Purpose doesn't work that way. You can't borrow someone else's calling. You can't import their conviction. Their purpose is theirs, and trying to make it yours feels hollow. Like you're performing passion you don't actually feel. Envy also creates comparison. You start measuring yourself against people who have clarity, and you always come up short. Not because you're failing at what they're doing, because you're not doing anything that feels equally important. Your work is fine. Your life is fine, but it doesn't have the weight, the significance, the alignment that theirs seems to have. And that comparison erodes your ability to value what you are doing. The trap is that purpose envy can make you chase purpose desperately. You try different paths, different causes, different frameworks, hoping one will give you the feeling you see in others. But desperation doesn't create clarity. It creates performance. You're not finding purpose. You're trying to manufacture the appearance of it. And the gap between the performance and the internal emptiness just makes the envy worse. Purpose envy doesn't resolve by finding your purpose. Because purpose isn't something you find. It's something that emerges when you stop looking for it and start paying attention to what actually matters to you. Not what should matter. Not what matters to others. What pulls you. What you care about even when it's inconvenient. Purpose isn't a destination. It's a direction. And it reveals itself when you're honest about what you're already moving toward, even if you haven't named it yet. Moral disorientation. Right and wrong used to be clear. Not always easy to follow, but clear. You had a compass, a sense of what was acceptable and what wasn't. And then something shifted. You encountered a situation where the rules didn't apply cleanly. Where doing the right thing in one context meant doing the wrong thing in another. And now when you try to navigate by your moral compass, it spins. No clear direction, no confident answer, just competing principles that can't all be honored at once. This is moral disorientation. Not the loss of values, the loss of the ability to use them. You still care about honesty, fairness, loyalty, compassion. But you've realized they contradict each other. Being honest might mean being cruel. Being fair might mean being disloyal. Being compassionate might mean being unjust. And when the values clash, you don't know which one takes precedence. Moral disorientation often starts with a specific incident, a moment where you had to choose between two goods or two bads. And whatever you chose, it felt wrong. Not because you made the wrong choice, because there was no right choice. And that realization that the moral framework you relied on doesn't give clear answers in complex situations undermines your confidence in the framework itself. What makes disorientation so destabilizing is that morality is supposed to guide action. When you're uncertain, you look to your values. But when your values contradict, when they don't provide clarity, you're left without guidance. You can't act confidently because you can't be sure you're acting rightly. Every decision becomes a negotiation between competing principles with no clear way to resolve the conflict. People experiencing moral disorientation describe a specific paralysis. They see multiple perspectives. They understand competing claims. They can make arguments for different positions, but that understanding doesn't lead to clarity. It leads to indecision, because every position has merit and every position has costs. And there's no objective way to determine which matters more. Disorientation intensifies when you're exposed to different moral frameworks. People who operate by completely different principles and seem to do fine. Cultures that prioritize different values. Systems that organize morality in incompatible ways. And once you see that, once you realize that moral certainty is culturally specific, not universal, your own certainty becomes harder to maintain. The trap is that moral disorientation can lead to moral relativism. If there's no clear right answer, if morality depends on context and perspective, maybe there's no right answer at all. Maybe every choice is equally valid. Maybe morality is just preference. And that sounds liberating until you realize it removes the basis for ethical judgment, including judgment of things you know are wrong. If everything is relative, nothing is condemnable. And that's not actually livable. Moral disorientation doesn't resolve by finding absolute rules. Those don't exist outside specific belief systems. It resolves when you accept that moral decisions are contextual and still commit to making them. When you acknowledge that values sometimes contradict, and you still have to choose. When you understand that the discomfort of uncertainty doesn't mean the decision doesn't matter. Morality isn't about perfect clarity. It's about doing the best you can with competing goods, acknowledging the costs, and accepting that sometimes there's no clean answer, just the least bad option, and choosing anyway. Emotional emptiness. You should be feeling something. Sadness, maybe. Or joy, or anger. The situation calls for it. Everyone else is reacting, but when you search inside for the emotion, it's not there. Not suppressed. Not hidden, just absent. Like the circuitry that's supposed to generate feeling has gone offline. You're going through the motions of responding. But internally there's nothing. Just a flat, neutral space where emotion should be. This is emotional emptiness. Not numbness from trauma, though it can look similar. A baseline absence of feeling that persists across situations. Good things happen. Bad things happen. And your internal state doesn't shift accordingly. You register the events intellectually. You understand what they mean, but the emotional response that should accompany that understanding doesn't show up. Emotional emptiness often develops gradually. You notice it first in small ways. A joke that should be funny lands flat. A loss that should hurt doesn't quite penetrate. A success that should feel good registers as relief but not joy. At first, you attribute it to circumstances. You're tired, stressed, burnt out, but then it persists. The tiredness passes but the flatness remains. And you start to realize the problem isn't situational, it's structural. What makes emotional emptiness so isolating is that emotions are how we connect. When someone shares joy, you're supposed to feel it with them. When they share pain, you're supposed to feel that too. But when you can't access the feelings, the connection doesn't happen. You can perform the appropriate responses, say the right things, make the right expressions, but the internal experience that makes those responses genuine is missing. And people can tell. Not always consciously, but they sense the distance. People experiencing emotional emptiness describe it as living behind glass. They can see life happening. They can observe emotions in others. They understand, intellectually, what people are feeling and why. But they can't feel it themselves. The glass is always there, separating them from direct emotional experience, keeping everything at a remove. Emptiness also affects decision-making. When you can't feel your way through choices, when you can't access gut reactions or emotional preferences, decisions become purely analytical, which is fine for some things. But relationships, careers, life direction, these require emotional input. You need to know what you want, what excites you, what matters enough to feel strongly about. And when feeling isn't available, those decisions become impossible. You're trying to navigate by a compass that only points to neutral. The cruelest part is that emotional emptiness doesn't spare you from knowing what you're missing. You remember feeling things. You can see others feeling things now. You understand conceptually that emotion adds dimension to life, makes experiences meaningful, creates connection. But understanding what you're missing doesn't bring it back. You're aware of the absence without being able to fill it. And that awareness, ironically, is one of the only feelings that breaks through. The quiet, persistent recognition that something fundamental is gone. Emotional emptiness doesn't resolve by forcing feeling. Emotions don't work that way. It resolves when it does by creating space for them to return, by removing the conditions that shut them down. Sometimes that's stress. Sometimes it's protection from old pain. Sometimes it's exhaustion. But the feelings are still there underneath, not lost, just suppressed so deeply they can't surface. And recovery isn't about generating new emotions. It's about removing the barriers that are keeping the existing ones from reaching you. Slowly, gently, until one day something lands, and you feel it. Not everything at once, just one thing. And that's where it starts. Relational meaning loss. The people are still there. You still see them, talk to them, share space with them. The relationship exists in form, but the meaning has drained out of it. What used to feel significant now feels obligatory. What used to connect you now just coexists. You're maintaining something that stopped mattering, and you can't tell if it's the relationship that changed or if it's you. This is relational meaning loss. Not the end of a relationship. The end of what made it important. The connection continues. You still go through the motions, but the substance underneath, the reason it mattered, has disappeared. And you're left with the shell of something that used to be real. Meaning loss often happens gradually. The relationship doesn't break. It just thins. Conversations become routine. Time together becomes habitual. The emotional investment that used to sustain the connection quietly withdraws. And by the time you notice, you're already distant. Still present. Still participating. But no longer genuinely engaged. What makes this so disorienting is that nothing obvious has gone wrong. There's no conflict. No betrayal. No clear breaking point. The relationship just stopped feeding something essential. And now you're in this strange position where you care about the person but not about the relationship. Where you value who they are but not what you are together. People experiencing relational meaning loss describe a specific guilt. The other person hasn't changed. They're still showing up. Still trying. But your investment has faded, and you can't explain why. You can't point to something they did wrong. The loss isn't about them. It's about the significance the relationship used to have for you. And that significance is gone. Loss also creates a dilemma. Do you stay and maintain the form even though the substance is missing? Do you leave and risk losing something that might matter again later? Do you try to revive what's been lost, and knowing you can't force meaning back into something that's become empty? None of the options feel right. So you drift. You stay in the relationship, but you stop being fully in it. And the gap between presence and investment widens. The trap is that relational meaning loss can spread. One relationship loses significance. Then another. Then another. Until you're surrounded by connections that feel hollow. And you start wondering if the problem isn't the relationships. If it's you. If you've lost the capacity to find meaning in connection itself. If every relationship will eventually thin out this way. And that thought, that possibility, makes investing in new connections feel pointless. Relational meaning loss doesn't resolve by forcing yourself to care. Meaning doesn't work that way. It resolves when you're honest about what the relationship has become. When you stop pretending the connection is deeper than it is. When you either accept the relationship for what it currently offers, limited as that might be, or you let it go to make space for connections that actually matter. Holding on to relationships that have lost meaning doesn't preserve them. It just keeps you stuck in something that's already ended. And that's not loyalty. That's avoidance. Future blankness. Try to imagine next year. 5 years from now. 10. What do you see? For most of your life you could picture something. Maybe not specifics, but a direction. A sense of where you were headed. Goals forming. Possibilities emerging. But now when you try to project forward, there's nothing. Not darkness. Not disaster. Just blank space. Like the future stops existing the moment it leaves the present. This is future blankness. Different from hopelessness. Hopelessness believes the future will be bad. Blankness can't imagine it at all. The capacity to envision what comes next has gone offline. You're not pessimistic about tomorrow. You just can't generate a picture of it. The imagination required to see forward has disappeared. Future blankness often follows prolonged uncertainty. When plans keep falling apart. When the trajectory you were following gets disrupted. When the future you were building toward becomes impossible. At first, you adjust. You revise. You imagine new possibilities. But after enough disruptions, the revision stops working. You stop being able to see beyond the immediate. The future collapses into the present. And anything past today feels abstract, inaccessible, unreal. What makes blankness so paralyzing is that planning requires vision. You can't move towards something you can't see. When the future is blank, decisions become impossible. Not because the options are bad, because they don't lead anywhere you can visualize. Every path just trails off into nothing. And without the ability to imagine where a choice leads, making the choice feels arbitrary. People experiencing future blankness describe living day to day, not by choice, by necessity. They can handle today, maybe tomorrow, but anything beyond that feels like trying to imagine a place that doesn't exist. They go through routines. They fulfill obligations. But they're not building toward anything. Because building requires seeing the structure you're creating. And the structure is invisible. Blankness also affects motivation. When you can see a future you want, you work toward it. But when the future is blank, when there's nothing to work toward, effort loses its justification. Why try when trying doesn't lead anywhere? Why invest when you can't picture the return? The absence of future vision removes the engine of forward movement. And you're left maintaining the present without any sense of why. The cruelest part is that future blankness makes you invisible to others. People ask about your plans, your goals, what you're working toward, and you don't have answers. Not because you're being evasive. Because the future they're asking about doesn't exist for you. It's blank. And trying to explain that, trying to make them understand that you can't see what they see, makes you feel broken. Like everyone else has access to a dimension you've lost. Future blankness doesn't resolve by forcing vision. You can't manufacture imagination. It resolves when you stop trying to see the whole path and start focusing on the next step. When you accept that the future doesn't have to be visible to move toward it. When you let the path reveal itself incrementally, instead of demanding the whole picture up front. The blankness might not lift, but movement is still possible. One decision at a time. One day extending into the next. Not because you can see where it's going, because standing still is worse than moving blind. Self-discontinuity. You're not who you used to be. That's normal. People change. But this isn't change. It's fracture. The person you were doesn't connect to the person you are. Your past feels like someone else's life. Your decisions then don't make sense now. And when you try to explain yourself, to tell the story of how you got here, the narrative breaks. There's no through line. Just versions of you that don't add up to a coherent whole. This is self-discontinuity. The loss of continuity between past, present, and future selves. You're not one person evolving over time. You're multiple people strung together by circumstance. And the thread that's supposed to connect them, the sense of being the same self across time, has snapped. Self-discontinuity often follows major shifts. Trauma that splits you into before and after. Identity changes that make your past self unrecognizable. Transitions so complete that who you were feels foreign. At first, the discontinuity feels like growth. Like you've left behind a version of yourself that wasn't working. But then you realize you haven't integrated the change. You've just replaced one self with another. And the selves don't communicate. They don't inform each other. They just exist in sequence, disconnected. What makes discontinuity so destabilizing is that identity requires continuity. You're supposed to be the same person over time. Your memories are supposed to be your memories. Your experiences are supposed to build on each other. But when continuity breaks, when past and present don't connect, you lose the foundation of selfhood. You're not growing. You're fragmenting, and each fragment is coherent on its own but incompatible with the others. People experiencing self-discontinuity describe looking at old photos and not recognizing themselves. Not physically. Psychologically. The person in the photo made decisions the current person can't understand. Held beliefs the current person doesn't share. Wanted things the current person can't relate to. And there's no bridge between them. No explanation for how that person became this person. Just a gap. Discontinuity also affects relationships. People who knew the old you expect the old you. They reference shared history. They assume continuity. But you don't feel continuous with the person they're remembering. You've changed so completely that their version of you feels like a character you used to play. And when they treat you like that character, when they expect responses based on who you were, it reinforces the disconnect. You're not that person anymore. But you can't explain who you are now because the story doesn't hold together. The trap is that discontinuity makes you doubt your own history. If you're not continuous with your past self, are your memories even yours? Did those things happen to you or to someone else? And if they happen to someone else, who are you? Without the continuity to link past to present, your entire identity becomes provisional. You're whoever you are right now. With no guarantee you'll be this person tomorrow. Self-discontinuity doesn't resolve by forcing coherence. You can't make disparate selves connect if they don't. It resolves when you accept that continuity isn't always linear. That you can contain multiple versions, contradictory versions, without requiring them to form a single narrative. The breaks are real. The fragments are real. But they're all still you. Not because they connect seamlessly, because they're what you're made of. And learning to hold discontinuity without demanding unity is the only way to stop fracturing further. Existential fatigue. You're tired. Not physically, not from overwork, from existing, from the constant, low-level effort required to keep being a person. To make decisions, maintain relationships, manage emotions, hold yourself together. It's exhausting. And the exhaustion doesn't lift with rest. Because it's not about energy. It's about the weight of continued existence. And that weight never goes away. This is existential fatigue. Not burnout. Not depression, though it can overlap. A specific weariness that comes from the ongoing demand to be. To show up. To participate. To keep living when living itself feels like work. And you're tired of working. Existential fatigue often builds over time. Small efforts accumulate, the constant need to be appropriate. To manage impressions. To handle responsibilities. To navigate relationships. Each individual task is manageable. But together, sustained over years, they create a cumulative load that becomes unbearable. And one day you realize you're exhausted not from doing too much. From doing anything at all. What makes existential fatigue so persistent is that rest doesn't help. You can take a break. Reduce obligations. Clear your schedule. But the fatigue remains, because the source isn't external demands. It's the internal effort of existing. Of maintaining a self. Of continuing to be a person in the world. And you can't rest from that. It's constant, required, inescapable. People experiencing existential fatigue describe everything as heavy, not difficult. Heavy. Getting up. Having a conversation. Making a decision. Responding to a text. Tasks that should be automatic require conscious effort. And the effort, multiplied across every interaction, every choice, every moment of being present, becomes overwhelming. You're not struggling to do hard things. You're struggling to do anything. Because even the easiest tasks carry the weight of having to exist to complete them. Fatigue also changes how you relate to time. When you're rested, time passes. When you're existentially fatigued, time stretches. Every moment requires endurance. Every day feels long. Not because anything is happening, because you have to be present for all of it. And presence, when you're this tired, is labor. Constant, draining, inescapable labor. The cruelest part is that existential fatigue makes you resent being alive. Not in a suicidal way. In a tired way. You don't want to die. You just want to stop. To not have to be any more. To be released from the constant demand to show up, to function, to continue. But there's no release. Only more days. More moments. More ongoing requirement to exist. And the exhaustion of knowing that just deepens the fatigue. Existential fatigue doesn't resolve by doing less. It resolves, when it does, by finding something that makes existence feel less like work. Something that pulls instead of pushes. Something you want to be present for instead of something you have to endure. That's not a goal to achieve. It's a shift in how being alive feels. From obligation to engagement. From weight to momentum. And that shift doesn't happen by trying harder. It happens when you stop trying to push through and start asking what you're actually living for. Not what you should live for. What actually makes showing up feel less like endless labor. Detached living. You're going through the motions. Work, relationships, routines. Everything that makes up a life. But you're not in it. You're adjacent to it, observing your own existence from a slight distance. Nothing feels fully real. Nothing fully penetrates. You're participating, but only technically. The engagement that would make participation meaningful is missing. This is detached living. Not the temporary dissociation that happens during stress. A sustained state of being removed from your own life. You're there. You're functioning. But there's a persistent gap between you and your experience. Like you're living through glass. everything is visible. Everything is accessible, but you can't quite touch it directly. Detached living often starts as protection. Life gets overwhelming. Emotions get too intense. And your mind creates distance as a defense. You step back. You observe instead of experience. And it helps. It makes things manageable. But then the distance becomes permanent. What started as temporary protection becomes default mode. And you can't close the gap anymore. You're stuck watching your life instead of living it. What makes detachment so strange is that you're aware of it. You know you should be more engaged. You can see what you're missing. But knowing doesn't fix it. The awareness just makes the gap more obvious. You're conscious of being disconnected from your own consciousness. And that meta-awareness, that watching yourself watch yourself, only deepens the detachment. People experiencing detached living describe feeling like an actor in their own life. They're performing the role of themselves, going through appropriate motions, saying appropriate things, showing up in appropriate ways. But the performance never becomes real. They're always aware it's a performance. Always aware they're playing a part instead of being a person. And that awareness prevents the authenticity that would make the performance unnecessary. Detachment also affects memory. When you're detached while experiencing something, the memory forms differently. It's there, but it doesn't feel like it happened to you. It feels like you observed it happening. So you accumulate a life's worth of experiences that don't integrate into your sense of self. Events occurred. You were present for them. But they're stored as things you witnessed, not things you lived. The trap is that detachment feels safe. It protects you from being hurt, from being disappointed, from being overwhelmed. So even when you want to engage more directly, part of you resists. Because engagement means vulnerability. And detachment, for all its emptiness, is predictable. It keeps you safe from the highs and lows. But that safety comes at a cost. You're protected from pain by being protected from everything. And the protection, eventually, becomes its own form of suffering. Detached living doesn't resolve by forcing engagement. You can't think your way into direct experience. It resolves by finding moments small enough that the defenses don't activate. Experiences simple enough that you can be present for them without triggering the need to retreat. A taste that actually registers. A sensation that lands directly. A moment where you're not watching yourself have an experience, you're just having it. And slowly, those moments expand. The detachment doesn't disappear completely. But it loosens, and space opens for something more immediate. More real, more lived. Absurdity perception. Look at what people do. The rituals. The systems. The structures everyone treats as important. When you really look, when you strip away the habit and the convention, none of it makes sense. We're animals on a rock pretending our made-up rules matter. Following scripts we inherited. Taking seriously things that are fundamentally arbitrary. And once you see that, once you really see the absurdity, you can't unsee it. This is absurdity perception. Not cynicism. Not nihilism. The clear-eyed recognition that most of what humans do is elaborate pretending. We create meaning where none exists. We build structures that have no foundation. We live according to logic that only works if everyone agrees not to question it. And it's all, at its core, absurd. Absurdity perception often comes in moments of clarity. You're in a meeting discussing something supposedly important. And suddenly you see it. Everyone is taking this seriously because everyone else is taking it seriously. But the thing itself, divorced from the shared performance, is meaningless. Or you're following a social rule, and you realize the rule only exists because someone decided it should. And everyone keeps following it because that's what we do. But there's no actual reason. It's just collective pretending. What makes absurdity perception so destabilizing is that it undermines participation. When you see that something is fundamentally arbitrary, it's hard to take it seriously. When you understand that the rules are made up, following them feels absurd. You can still participate. You can still go through the motions. But the genuine investment is gone. You're aware you're playing a game, and awareness kills the game. People experiencing absurdity perception describe feeling like they're in on a joke no one else sees. Everyone around them is earnestly engaged, treating arbitrary things as if they matter inherently, following rules as if the rules have authority beyond collective agreement. And they can see it's all performance, all pretending, all humans making things up as we go, and then acting like what we made up is real. Perception also creates distance. When you see the absurdity of social structures, you can't engage with them the same way. Work becomes a game you're aware is a game. Relationships become performances you're aware are performances. Meaning becomes something you know you're constructing, not discovering. And that knowledge, that awareness, makes genuine participation impossible. You're always watching, always aware, always outside the illusion even when you're inside the system. The trap is that absurdity perception can lead to paralysis. If it's all absurd, why do anything? If meaning is constructed and rules are arbitrary, why follow any particular path? The perception reveals that nothing has inherent significance. And without inherent significance, choice becomes impossible. Or rather, choice becomes so wide open that it collapses under its own freedom. You can do anything because nothing actually matters. And that freedom, paradoxically, makes doing anything feel pointless. Absurdity perception doesn't resolve by finding hidden meaning. The absurdity is real. It resolves when you accept that absurdity doesn't negate value, that things can be made up and still matter, that meaning can be constructed and still be meaningful, that the game can be a game and still be worth playing. Not because there's some deeper truth underneath, because playing, even when you know it's play, is better than refusing to participate. The absurdity doesn't go away, but it stops being a reason to disengage. And that acceptance, that willingness to take seriously what you know is arbitrary, is the only way to live in a world you've seen through. Directionless striving. You're working hard, constantly busy, always pushing towards something. But when someone asks what you're building, what you're aiming for, the answer fragments. You have tasks, projects, deadlines, but no clear destination. You're striving without direction, moving without knowing where you're going, and the motion, for all its intensity, doesn't feel like progress. It feels like running in place. This is directionless striving. Effort without orientation. You're not lazy. You're not passive. You're actively engaged. But the engagement doesn't connect to any larger purpose. You're optimizing, improving, achieving. But when you step back and ask what it's all for, the answer isn't there. Just more striving, more motion, more effort that doesn't accumulate into anything coherent. Directionless striving often comes from momentum. You started moving in some direction. It felt productive. So you kept going, added more, did more. And now you're so deep in the doing that you've lost track of why you started. The motion has become its own justification. You strive because you're already striving. Because stopping feels like failure. Because at least moving feels better than standing still. What makes this so exhausting is that effort without direction never resolves. When you're moving towards something, reaching it brings closure. But when you're just moving, there's no end point. No moment where you can stop and say it's done. You finish one thing and immediately start another. Not because the next thing matters. Because not striving feels wrong. Like you're wasting potential. Like you should be doing more. People experiencing directionless striving describe a treadmill feeling. They're working hard, expending energy, but getting nowhere. Every achievement is immediately replaced by the next goal. Every completion leads to another task, and the cycle continues without ever producing the feeling of having arrived anywhere. Just constant motion, constant effort, constant striving that never amounts to progress. Striving without direction also creates comparison problems. When you don't know where you're going, you measure yourself against everyone else's apparent direction. They seem focused, purposeful, moving towards something clear, and you're just doing things, working hard at objectives that feel arbitrary. And the comparison makes the directionlessness more obvious. They're building something. You're just busy. The trap is that directionless striving can look successful. You're productive. You're achieving. You're advancing in measurable ways. So people praise your work ethic, your drive, your ambition. And you accept the praise because at least it validates the effort. But internally, you know the effort isn't building toward anything meaningful. You're just good at looking like you're going somewhere. Directionless striving doesn't resolve by working harder. More effort without direction is just more motion. It resolves when you stop long enough to ask where you're trying to go. Not where you should go. Not where others are going. Where you actually want to end up. And that requires stopping, which feels impossible when motion is the only thing keeping you from confronting that you don't have an answer. Chronic inner emptiness. It's always there, not acute, not overwhelming. Just a low-level absence that never quite goes away. You fill your days. You connect with people. You pursue things. But underneath all of it, there's a hollow space that nothing quite reeks. And you've learned to function around it. To live with the emptiness as background noise. But it's always there, quietly reminding you that something fundamental is missing. This is chronic inner emptiness. Not situational emptiness that comes and goes. A baseline condition. A structural void that persists regardless of what's happening in your life. Good things can happen. You can be surrounded by people. You can be successful. And the emptiness remains. Untouched. Unfilled. Just there. Chronic emptiness often has no clear origin. Sometimes it formed in childhood, from needs that went unmet, from attachment that never secured, from experiences that required you to shut down parts of yourself. But sometimes it just is. No obvious cause. No clear beginning. Just an emptiness that's been there so long you can't remember not feeling it. And trying to trace it back doesn't help. Because understanding where it came from doesn't make it go away. What makes chronic emptiness so persistent is that it doesn't respond to external fixes. You can't fill it with relationships, with achievements, with experiences. You can pour things into the space and they just disappear. The emptiness absorbs them without being satisfied. Because it's not about lacking something specific. It's about lacking the capacity to be filled. The structure that would allow things to land and stay is missing. So everything passes through without sticking. People living with chronic emptiness describe it as exhausting in a specific way. Not the exhaustion of doing too much. The exhaustion of trying to fill something unfillable. You keep reaching for things that should help. Keep investing in experiences that should matter, but they don't reach the empty space. And the constant effort to make something land, to make something satisfy, drains you without ever producing the feeling of being full. Emptiness also shapes relationships. When you're chronically empty, you look to others to fill you. Not consciously, not manipulatively, but the need is there. And it's too big for any person to meet. So relationships become sites of disappointment. Not because the other person fails. Because no person can fill a structural void. They can offer connection, support, love, but it slides past the emptiness. And you're left feeling alone even when you're not. The cruelest part is that chronic emptiness creates shame. You have things that should make you feel full, people who care. achievements that should matter. And yet the emptiness remains, which makes you feel broken. Like something is fundamentally wrong with you. Like you're incapable of the satisfaction others seem to access naturally. And that shame reinforces the emptiness, makes you hide it, makes you perform fullness while feeling hollow inside. Chronic inner emptiness doesn't heal by being filled. It heals when it does by being acknowledged, by stopping the attempt to make it go away and learning to exist with it. Not as a problem to solve, as a condition to live with. The emptiness might not disappear, but the exhaustion of trying to eliminate it can. And in that acceptance, in that release of the demand that you be full, space opens for connection that doesn't need to fix you, just meets you where you are, incomplete, empty, but still here. Meaning substitution. You know what you're missing? Real connection, genuine purpose. Something that actually matters. But those things are hard. They require vulnerability, risk, patience. So you substitute. You find something easier, something more controllable, something that mimics the feeling without demanding the cost. And it works. For a while. Until you realize the substitute isn't actually satisfying the need. It's just keeping you from noticing how hungry you are. This is meaning substitution, replacing authentic sources of meaning with more accessible alternatives. Not consciously, not deliberately. But when the real thing feels out of reach, when it requires more than you have to give, you settle for approximations. And the approximations keep you functional, but they don't actually feed you. Meaning substitution shows up everywhere. You want deep connection but settle for shallow socializing. You want meaningful work but settle for career advancement. You want genuine purpose but settle for productivity. Each substitute delivers something. Enough to keep you going. Enough to prevent complete emptiness. But not enough to actually satisfy. Just enough to make you stop looking for the real thing. What makes substitution so insidious is that it's invisible while it's happening. The substitute feels like progress. Like you're addressing the need. You're socializing, so you must be connected. You're advancing, so you must be fulfilled. You're productive, so you must have purpose. And the substitution works well enough that you don't question it. Until something shifts, and you realize you've been surviving on empty calories. Going through the motions of meaning without accessing the substance. People experiencing meaning substitution describe a specific dissatisfaction. They're doing the things that should work, engaging in activities that look right. But the engagement isn't landing. Socializing doesn't create connection. Achievement doesn't create fulfillment. Productivity doesn't create purpose. And they can't figure out why. They're doing everything correctly. So why does it still feel empty? Substitution also compounds over time. The longer you rely on substitutes, the more you forget what the real thing feels like. Connection becomes synonymous with having plans. Purpose becomes synonymous with staying busy. Meaning becomes synonymous with checking boxes. And the original need, the one the substitute was meant to address, gets buried under layers of approximation, until you're so disconnected from what you actually need that you can't even name it anymore. The trap is that substitutes are easier. They're more available, more controllable, less risky. Real connection requires vulnerability and you might get hurt. Real purpose requires commitment and you might fail. Real meaning requires depth and that's uncomfortable. So you keep choosing the substitute. Keep settling for the approximation. And the gap between what you have and what you need widens without you noticing. Meaning substitution doesn't resolve by adding more substitutes. More socializing doesn't create connection. More achievement doesn't create purpose. It resolves when you're honest about what you're actually doing. When you stop pretending the substitute is the real thing. When you acknowledge that you've been avoiding the harder, riskier, more demanding path because it scares you. And that honesty, that willingness to admit you've been settling, is what creates the possibility of reaching for something real. Identity meaning split. You know who you are. Your identity is clear, professional, parent, partner, creative, advocate, whatever labels fit. But when you ask yourself what it all means, why it matters, the answer doesn't connect. Your identity exists, but it doesn't mean anything. You're playing roles that define you without fulfilling you, and the gap between who you are and what that means has become unbridgeable. This is the identity meaning split. When your sense of self is clear but divorced from significance, you're not confused about your identity. You're confused about why your identity should matter. The roles you inhabit don't connect to any larger purpose. They're just positions you occupy, labels that organize your life without adding meaning to it. The split often develops when identity precedes meaning. You become something before you understand why. You take on roles because they're expected, because they're available, because that's what the next step looked like. And then you inhabit those roles successfully. You're good at being what you've become, but the being doesn't connect to mattering. You have an identity, but the identity doesn't have a point. What makes the split so destabilizing is that identity is supposed to provide meaning. Who you are should tell you what matters. Your roles should give you direction. But when they don't, when identity is just a collection of functions you perform without deeper significance, you're left navigating life with a clear sense of self that doesn't actually guide you toward anything meaningful. People experiencing the identity meaning split describe feeling successful but empty. They've achieved the identity they were working toward. They're recognized as who they've become. But the recognition doesn't satisfy. The achievement doesn't feel like accomplishment, because the identity, for all its clarity, doesn't connect to anything that actually matters to them. It's just what they are, not why they are. The split also creates performance fatigue. When your identity doesn't mean anything to you, maintaining it becomes exhausting. You're being who you're supposed to be, fulfilling the expectations that come with your roles. But you're doing it without internal investment, just going through the motions of being yourself. And that performance, that constant enactment of an identity that doesn't connect to meaning, drains you. The trap is that the split is hard to articulate. You sound ungrateful. You have an identity. You've achieved recognition. What more do you want? And the answer is complicated. Because what you want isn't a different identity. It's for your current identity to mean something. For who you are to connect to why you are. And that's not something you can achieve. It's something that has to emerge. And emergence requires more than performance. The identity meaning split doesn't resolve by changing who you are. New identities without meaning just create new versions of the same problem. It resolves when you stop deriving identity from external roles and start building it from internal values. When who you are emerges from what you care about instead of what you do. When identity becomes an expression of meaning instead of a substitute for it. And that shift, that reorientation, requires letting go of identities that look good but feel hollow, which is terrifying, because those identities might be all you have. Lost future imagination. You used to be able to picture it, not just tomorrow or next week, years ahead, possibilities forming, paths branching, a sense of what could be. But that capacity has disappeared. When you try to imagine the future now, your mind hits a wall. Not a specific obstacle, just an inability to generate the image. The future doesn't exist as a space you can see into anymore. It's just blank, inaccessible, gone. This is lost future imagination, different from future blankness where you can't see specifics. This is the loss of the imaginative capacity itself. You're not struggling to envision what the future holds. You're struggling to envision the future at all. The mechanism that used to project forward has stopped working. And without it, planning, hoping, striving all become impossible. Because they require a future you can imagine. And you can't. Lost imagination often follows prolonged disappointment. Plans that repeatedly failed. Futures that never materialized. Hope that led to heartbreak. Each time you projected forward and the projection didn't match reality, the capacity weakened. And eventually, your mind stopped bothering. Stopped generating possibilities it didn't believe in. Stopped imagining futures it couldn't trust. The imagination didn't disappear. It shut down. Because imagining became too painful when imagination never matched what actually arrived. What makes lost imagination so paralyzing is that it removes the ability to want. When you can't imagine the future, you can't want things in it. Goals require vision. Desire requires possibility. Hope requires the capacity to picture something better. And when imagination is gone, all of that goes with it. You're not pessimistic about the future. You're disconnected from it entirely. It's not a space you can access. Not a time you can relate to. Just an abstraction that has nothing to do with you. People who've lost future imagination describe living in an eternal present. Not by choice. By limitation. Today is real. Tomorrow might be real. But anything beyond immediate proximity doesn't exist as something they can conceptualize. They can understand intellectually that time will pass. That the future will become the present. But they can't imagine themselves in it. Can't picture who they'll be or what they'll be doing. The future is just a void their mind refuses to populate. Lost imagination also affects identity. Who you are is partly who you're becoming. Your future self is part of your current sense of self. But when you can't imagine that future self, when you can't picture who you're turning into, your identity becomes purely present tense. You're who you are right now, with no trajectory, no development, no sense of moving toward anything. Just static existence in perpetual today. The cruelest part is that lost imagination makes others' futures feel alien. People talk about their plans, their hopes, what they're building toward, and you can't relate. Not because you don't care about them, because the future they're describing doesn't exist for you. It's not a space you can access, so their excitement feels distant. Their anticipation feels foreign. And the gap between their relationship to time and yours makes connection harder. Lost future imagination doesn't return by forcing it. You can't make yourself imagine what your mind has decided is too risky to picture. It returns when it does, gradually. Through small moments where the future becomes safe enough to peek at. Not the whole trajectory, just the next step. And then maybe the one after that. The imagination doesn't flood back. It trickles. One small possibility at a time. Until eventually, without you noticing, you're picturing something weeks ahead. Then months. And the future starts existing again. Not as certainty, as possibility, which is all imagination ever was. Disenchanted existence. The world used to feel larger, more mysterious, like there were depths you hadn't reached yet. Possibilities you hadn't encountered, something beyond the surface waiting to be discovered. But now everything feels explained, mapped, reduced to mechanics and systems. The mystery is gone. The magic is gone. And what you're left with is a flat, noble world where everything has an explanation and nothing feels truly extraordinary anymore. This is disenchanted existence. Not cynicism. Not pessimism. The loss of wonder. The flattening of reality into pure utility and function. Everything becomes what it does, what it's for, how it works. And the dimension that made it more than just function, that made it feel meaningful or mysterious or sacred, has evaporated. You're living in a world that's been completely demystified. And the demystification has drained it of something essential. Disenchantment often comes from over-explanation. You learn how things work, the mechanisms behind experiences, the psychology behind emotions, the evolutionary function of connection, and each explanation makes sense, adds understanding, but it also removes mystery, reduces experience to cause and effect, turns what felt meaningful into just another system operating according to predictable rules. What makes disenchantment so deadening is that it removes the transcendent. When everything is explicable, when everything reduces to function, there's no room for awe. No space for the feeling that you're encountering something beyond your understanding. No possibility of experiencing something as sacred. Everything is just what it is, operating how it operates. And that flatness, that total reduction, makes existence feel smaller, more confined, less worth inhabiting. People experiencing disenchanted existence describe a specific boredom. Not the boredom of having nothing to do. The boredom of living in a world where nothing surprises you anymore. Where every experience can be predicted. Every emotion can be explained. Every moment can be categorized. The world has become so thoroughly mapped that there's nowhere left to discover. No corner that hasn't been explained away. Disenchantment also affects relationships. When you see people purely in functional terms, when you understand them as systems responding to inputs, the sense of encountering another consciousness diminishes. They become predictable, explainable, operating according to psychology you understand. And that understanding, that reduction of people to mechanisms, makes genuine connection harder. Because connection requires treating the other person as more than just a system. As something with depths that exceed your understanding. The trap is that disenchantment masquerades as maturity, as clear-seeing, as refusing to be fooled by illusions. You've stripped away the mystification. You see things as they are, and that feels like progress. Like you've achieved a kind of clarity others lack. But what you've actually achieved is a world where nothing can touch you deeply anymore. Because deep touching requires mystery, requires the possibility that something might be more than you understand it to be. And you've explained that possibility away. Disenchanted existence doesn't resolve by pretending mystery back into things. Forced wonder is just performance. It resolves when you accept that understanding something doesn't exhaust it. That knowing how something works doesn't mean you've captured what it is. That explanation and meaning occupy different dimensions. A sunset understood is still a sunset. Love explained is still love. And the world, for all its explicability, still contains more than your explanations can hold. The enchantment isn't in not knowing. It's in knowing and still being moved. Worldview collapse. The framework broke. Not a belief, not an opinion. The entire system you used to make sense of reality. The way you understood how the world works, what people are, why things happen. It held for years. And then it didn't. Something happened that the framework couldn't explain, couldn't accommodate, and instead of bending, it shattered. And now you're standing in the wreckage trying to make sense of a world that no longer makes sense. This is worldview collapse. Different from losing a belief. When a worldview collapses, you don't just lose one piece. You lose the structure that organized all the pieces. The coherent understanding that made reality interpretable. And without that structure, everything becomes unstable. You can't trust your judgments. Can't predict outcomes. Can't navigate situations with confidence. Because the map you were using has been revealed as fiction. Worldview collapse often follows a single shattering experience. Betrayal that reveals people aren't who you thought they were. Injustice that shows the system doesn't work how you believed. Suffering that exposes the randomness you'd been denying. One event that the worldview can't absorb. And instead of adjusting the worldview, the event destroys it. Because the adjustment required would be too fundamental. Would mean admitting the entire framework was wrong. What makes collapse so destabilizing is that worldviews are invisible while they're working. You don't realize you have one. You think you're just seeing reality. But you're seeing reality through a framework. And when the framework breaks, you realize how much of what you thought was observation was actually interpretation. And that interpretation, it turns out, was based on assumptions that aren't true. People experiencing worldview collapse describe everything feeling uncertain. Not specific things. Everything. They can't trust their understanding of situations. Can't rely on their assessments of people. Can't assume their predictions about how things will unfold. Because all of that was built on a foundation that's been revealed as false. And rebuilding takes time. If it happens at all. Collapse also creates isolation. You can't explain to others what you're experiencing, because explaining requires a shared framework. And your framework is gone. When you try to articulate why everything feels uncertain, why you can't make judgments the way you used to, they don't understand. Their frameworks are still intact. They're still seeing the world through coherent lenses. And you're just seeing chaos. The trap is that worldview collapse makes you vulnerable to replacement frameworks. When you're lost, when nothing makes sense, any coherent explanation feels appealing. So you're susceptible to ideologies, to belief systems that promise clarity, to frameworks that explain everything cleanly, and you might adopt them desperately. Not because they're true, because having any framework feels better than having none. Worldview collapse doesn't resolve by finding the right worldview, because the collapse revealed that all worldviews are constructions, useful fictions we use to organize reality into something manageable. It resolves when you build a new framework, knowing it's provisional, knowing it will encounter things it can't explain, knowing it's not reality, just a tool for navigating reality. And that humility, that willingness to hold your understanding lightly, is the only protection against the next collapse. Existential shame. It's not about what you've done, not about mistakes or failures. It's deeper. A shame about being at all. About taking up space. About existing when your existence doesn't seem justified. Like you're supposed to earn the right to be here. And you haven't. So your presence itself feels like an imposition. An intrusion. Something to apologize for. This is existential shame. Not guilt about actions. Shame about existence itself. The feeling that you shouldn't be. That your being here is somehow wrong. That you need to justify taking up space, consuming resources, requiring attention. And no justification feels adequate. So you carry a constant, low-level sense that you're intruding on a world that would be better without you. Existential shame often forms early, from experiences that communicated your existence was burdensome, from needs that were treated as impositions, from a sense that you were wanted conditionally. If you behaved right, if you didn't cause problems, if you earned your place, and that conditionality gets internalized, becomes the belief that existence itself requires justification. That being is something you have to deserve. What makes existential shame so pervasive is that it's not tied to anything specific. You can't fix it by correcting a mistake. Can't resolve it by achieving something. Because it's not about what you do. It's about what you are. And what you are fundamentally feels wrong. Feels like too much. Feels like you're taking up room that should go to someone else. Someone who actually deserves to exist. People carrying existential shame describe constant apologizing, not just saying sorry. Living apologetically, making themselves small, minimizing their needs, downplaying their accomplishments, treating their presence as something to be excused. They're not performing humility. They genuinely believe they're imposing, that their existence is a burden others are kind enough to tolerate. Shame also prevents asking for things. When you believe your existence is already an imposition, requesting anything additional feels impossible. Help, support, attention. All of it requires acknowledging you of needs. And needs feel like proof that you're too much, that you're demanding more than you've earned. So you learn to need nothing, to require nothing, to exist as quietly and self-sufficiently as possible, hoping that if you're small enough, your presence will be forgivable. The cruelest part is that existential shame makes love feel impossible. When someone cares about you, when they want to give you attention, support, presence, it doesn't feel like love. It feels like you're tricking them, like they'll eventually realize you're not worth it. And the waiting for that realization, that inevitable moment when they see you're not worth the space you take, that's constant. You can't accept their care, because you can't believe you deserve it. Existential shame doesn't heal by achieving worth, because the shame isn't about lacking worth. It's about the belief that existence itself requires earning, and you can't earn the right to be. Being is unconditional. You exist, not because you've justified it, just because you do. And healing means accepting that your existence doesn't need defense, that you're allowed to be here. That taking up space, having needs, requiring care, that's not an imposition. That's just what being alive is. And you're allowed to be alive, even if you haven't earned it, even if you never do. Numb purpose seeking. You're looking for it, actively searching, reading books, trying new things, asking questions, going through all the motions of someone seeking purpose. But the search feels mechanical. You're following the steps without the drive behind them, checking boxes without the hope that checking them will lead anywhere. You're seeking purpose not because you believe you'll find it, because not seeking feels like giving up, and you're not ready for that yet. This is numb purpose seeking, the hollow performance of searching for meaning when the capacity to feel meaning has gone offline. You're doing what someone who cares would do. But the caring isn't there. Just the motion, just the routine. Just the vague sense that you should be looking for something even though you're not sure it exists, or that you'd recognize it if you found it. Numb seeking often follows prolonged disappointment. You tried to find purpose, multiple times. Each attempt felt promising, and each one failed to deliver. Eventually, the hoping stopped. The investment withdrew, but the seeking continued. Not because you believe anymore, because the alternative, accepting that purpose might not exist for you, is too final, too frightening. So you keep searching, but numbly, going through the motions while feeling nothing. What makes numb seeking so exhausting is that it's effort without energy. You're doing things, engaging with possibilities, exploring options, but there's no vitality behind it, no curiosity, no genuine interest, just the mechanical performance of seeking. Like you're following a script for how someone finds purpose without actually being that someone. People experiencing numb purpose seeking describe it as checking boxes. They do the things that are supposed to help: therapy, meditation, new hobbies, career changes, spiritual practices, and they do them correctly. They show up, they participate, but nothing lands, nothing sparks, nothing feels like it might be the thing. Just more activities, more attempts, more hollow engagement with the search. Seeking also becomes its own distraction. As long as you're searching, you don't have to face that maybe there's nothing to find. The motion itself keeps the question alive, keeps the possibility open. And stopping would mean admitting that all the seeking was pointless. That purpose isn't out there waiting to be discovered. That maybe the entire framework of seeking and finding doesn't work. And that admission feels unbearable. The trap is that numb seeking can last indefinitely. You can perform the search for years, decades, always looking, never finding, never quite giving up, just going through increasingly elaborate motions while feeling less and less with each attempt. until the search becomes the thing you do instead of living. A way to avoid confronting that you might be living a life that doesn't have the meaning you're searching for. Numb purpose seeking doesn't resolve by finding purpose. It resolves when you stop searching and start paying attention. When you notice what you're already doing, what you're already drawn to, what already engages you even without the promise of capital P purpose. Because purpose isn't something you find. It's something that emerges when you're paying attention to what's actually pulling you. And you can't see what's pulling you when you're too busy performing the search for something bigger. Isolation of meaning. You've found it. Meaning, purpose. Something that matters deeply to you. But when you try to share it, when you try to explain why it's significant, people don't get it. They're polite. They nod. But you can see it doesn't land, doesn't resonate. What feels profound to you feels trivial to them, and you're left holding something meaningful in isolation, unable to share it, unable to connect around it, alone in your significance. This is isolation of meaning, not the absence of meaning, the inability to share it. You have what others are searching for, but it's yours alone. And that solitude, that fundamental inability to make others understand why something matters, creates a specific kind of loneliness. You're not alone in life. You're alone in what makes life meaningful. Isolation of meaning often happens with specific sources. A cause that matters to you that others dismiss. A creative pursuit others see as hobby. A relationship others don't understand. A belief others find odd. The thing itself isn't the problem. The problem is that its significance is invisible to everyone else. They see the surface. You experience the depth. And the gap is unbridgeable. What makes isolated meaning so lonely is that sharing meaning is how we connect. When you find something that matters and others find it meaningful too, you bond over that shared significance. But when your meaning is yours alone, when others can't access why it matters, you can't connect through it. You're experiencing something profound in a way that makes you more separate, not more together. People experiencing isolation of meaning describe feeling misunderstood. Not about who they are, about what they care about. People know them, but they don't know why the things that matter most to them matter. And trying to explain just makes the gap more obvious. They can articulate the meaning. But articulation doesn't create understanding. Others hear the words without experiencing the significance behind them. Isolation also creates doubt. When meaning is shared, it feels validated, real. But when it's isolated, when no one else sees it, you start questioning. Maybe it's not actually meaningful. Maybe you're deluding yourself. Maybe the significance you experience is just personal eccentricity. And that doubt erodes the meaning itself, makes it harder to hold on to, easier to dismiss as foolishness. The trap is that isolation of meaning can make you withdraw. If others can't understand anyway, why share? Why try to explain? Why subject yourself to the evidence that what matters most to you doesn't matter to anyone else? So you stop trying. Keep your meaning private. And the privacy, the isolation, deepens. Until you're living a life that's meaningful, but completely unshareable. Rich in private significance, but empty of connection around what's significant. Isolation of meaning doesn't resolve by finding people who understand. Though that helps. It resolves when you accept that meaning doesn't require validation. That what matters to you can matter even if it only matters to you. That significance doesn't need to be shared to be real. And that acceptance, that willingness to hold meaning alone, paradoxically makes connection possible. Because you're not demanding others feel what you feel. Just accepting them while you feel what you feel. And sometimes, that acceptance creates space for understanding to emerge. Not always, but sometimes. Moral emptiness. Right and wrong used to mean something. Not just rules. Actual weight. Actual significance. Breaking them felt wrong internally. Unfolding them felt right, but that internal response has disappeared. Now when you encounter moral situations, there's nothing. No pull toward good. No repulsion from bad. Just a neutral space where moral feeling used to be. And you're left navigating ethics without the internal compass that makes ethics more than just social convention. This is moral emptiness. Not immorality. The absence of moral feeling. You still know what's considered right and wrong. You still follow the rules. But you follow them externally. Because that's what you're supposed to do. Not because you feel their rightness. The internal sense that used to guide moral action has gone quiet. And you're operating purely on learned behavior. No feeling behind it. No genuine moral intuition. Just compliance. Moral emptiness often follows moral injury. Experiences where doing the right thing led to terrible outcomes. Where the moral framework you believed in failed catastrophically. Where you were forced to choose between evils and every choice felt wrong. After enough of that, after enough situations where morality didn't map cleanly onto outcomes, the moral sense shuts down. Stops providing clear signals. Stops feeling like it means anything. What makes moral emptiness so disorienting is that morality is supposed to be felt. Not just known. When you see suffering, you're supposed to feel moved to help. When you see injustice, you're supposed to feel outrage. But when the feeling is gone, when you observe these things with complete neutrality, you're aware something essential is missing. You're functioning morally. But you're not experiencing morality. You're performing it. People experiencing moral emptiness describe going through the motions. They help because helping is what you do. They avoid harm because avoiding harm is the rule. But there's no internal drive behind it. No satisfaction in doing good. No discomfort in witnessing wrong. Just mechanical compliance with moral norms they no longer feel invested in. Emptiness also affects judgment. When you can't feel moral weight, when everything is equally neutral, making moral decisions becomes purely analytical, which is fine for some things. But moral questions often require more than analysis. They require the ability to feel what matters. And when that's gone, when you're trying to navigate complex moral terrain without moral intuition, you're lost. Operating by rules that feel arbitrary. Following guidelines you don't actually care about. The cruelest part is that moral emptiness makes you doubt your own humanity. If you can't feel moral pull, if you can't access the internal sense of right and wrong that seems fundamental to being a person, what are you? Are you just performing humanity? Following scripts without the substance behind them, and that doubt, that worry that you're morally dead inside, creates shame. Makes you hide the emptiness. Pretend to feel what you don't. Act outraged when you're actually neutral. Because admitting the emptiness would mean admitting you're not quite human anymore. Moral emptiness doesn't resolve by forcing feeling. Moral emotions don't work that way. It resolves, when it does, by removing the protection that created the numbness. By allowing yourself to be affected again. Which is terrifying. Because the numbness formed for a reason. To protect you from moral pain you couldn't handle. And recovery means making yourself vulnerable to that pain again. Slowly. Carefully. Until one day something breaks through. You feel moved by suffering, disturbed by injustice, and the moral sense, dormant for so long, starts waking up. Self-abandonment. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being on your own side. Stopped advocating for yourself. Stopped protecting your own interests. You prioritize everyone else, their needs, their comfort, their preferences. And when it comes to you, there's nothing. No one defending your boundaries. No one ensuring your needs get met, because the person who's supposed to do that, you, has abandoned the post. This is self-abandonment, not selflessness. The active withdrawal of self-support. You're not choosing to put others first from a position of fullness. You're betraying yourself. Sacrificing your own well-being not because it's right, but because you've stopped believing you deserve protection. Stop believing your needs matter. Stopped believing you're worth defending. Self-abandonment often starts as adaptation. You learn that your needs cause problems, that asserting yourself creates conflict, that taking care of yourself is selfish. So you stop, you accommodate, you yield. And it works. Conflict decreases. Others are happier, and you mistake their happiness for your own success, not realizing you've just learned to betray yourself for approval. What makes self-abandonment so destructive is that it's invisible while it's happening. You think you're being kind, flexible, easy to get along with, and you are. But you're achieving that by treating yourself as expendable, by constantly putting yourself last, by ensuring everyone else's needs are met while yours go unaddressed. And you don't notice the cost. Until one day you realize you've disappeared. You exist to serve others. But for yourself, there's nothing. People experiencing self-abandonment describe not knowing what they want. Not because they're indecisive. Because they've trained themselves not to have preferences. Preferences cause friction. So they've learned to not want, to not need, to be whatever the situation requires. And that flexibility, that ability to contort into any shape others need, has cost them the ability to hold a shape of their own. Abandonment also affects relationships. When you have no boundaries, when you sacrifice yourself reflexively, people learn to expect it. They're not necessarily taking advantage. You've just trained them that you'll always yield, always accommodate, always put yourself aside. And that becomes the relationship dynamic. They get what they need. You get the approval that comes from meeting their needs. But actual reciprocity, actual mutual care that never develops. Because you've never asked for it. Never demanded it. Never acted like you deserve it. The trap is that self-abandonment feels like virtue. Like you're being good by putting others first. Like sacrifice is love. And it can be, when it's chosen from wholeness. But when it's the only mode you know, when you can't not sacrifice yourself, it's not virtue. It's self-betrayal. And the abandonment, the constant prioritizing of everyone else, slowly erodes you. Until there's nothing left to abandon. Just an empty space where a self used to be. Self-abandonment doesn't resolve by becoming selfish. It resolves when you start treating yourself like someone who matters. Like someone whose needs are as valid as anyone else's. Like someone who deserves protection, care, advocacy. And that shift, that decision to be on your own side again, feels impossible at first. Because being on your own side means accepting that you deserve care. And if you've abandoned yourself long enough, that belief, that fundamental sense of deserving, has been eroded so thoroughly that rebuilding it requires starting from nothing. But starting is possible. You don't have to advocate loudly. Just stop betraying quietly. And that's where recovery begins.